of John Gotti, the Teflon Don. And what makes this one a little interesting.
You know, when I first heard that, I was like a YouTube transcript.
Yeah.
But it's actually really fascinating. The way this video frames Gotti's story really reveals how he's seen by a lot of people.
Yeah.
Even, all these years after his death.
It is. You almost get like a curated version of Gotti. It's almost like
Yeah.
a Funk hero narrative. So by kind of dissecting it, we can see how that myth of John Gotti has been built up and maintained. So let's start from the beginning. This video really emphasizes Gotti's tough childhood in East New York. He had to fight for everything.
Right.
They even have a story in there about Gotti refusing to meet his girlfriend's stepfather because the man was a Zulu.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating because it shows, his prejudices, but it also kind of foreshadows his willingness to defy the rules even within the mafia. I mean, this is an organization with a rigid hierarchy, tons of traditions.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And Gotti's disregard for those traditions really comes into play when he's rising through the ranks of the Gambino family. The video highlights his early clashes with the boss at the time, Paul Castellano, who, really disapproved of Gotti's style, like the flamboyance and his involvement in drug trafficking.
Yeah, Castellano was very much the old guard, the traditional mafia, strict code of conduct.
Yeah.
Gotti was more pragmatic, more interested in the money, consolidating power, even if it meant, breaking some rules.
Definitely. And that clash between the old and the new, tradition versus ambition, it ultimately leads to that dramatic event, the assassination of Paul Castellano.
Yeah, I mean, Gotti eliminating Castellano was a bold move, was a calculated risk for sure. It showed his ruthlessness and his ambition.
Absolutely.
But it also signaled a shift in the whole landscape of the mafia, away from the old ways and towards a more modern, a more aggressive style of leadership. I think it really raises the question, did Gotti's actions make Cosa Nostra stronger or weaker in the long run?
That's a great question, and we'll keep coming back to that as we go through the transcript. But for now, let's focus on what happened right after Castellano was killed. Gotti takes over as the boss of the Gambino family, and his public image explodes.
Right. This is where the whole Teflon Don image really takes off.
Yeah.
The video shows Gotti loving the media attention, dressing impeccably, holding court at, his favorite restaurants. He even throws a block party after one of his acquittals.
It's crazy. He's like a celebrity gangster at this point, basking in the spotlight, using it to cultivate this image of being invincible.
It is an effective image.
Yeah.
Gotti's lifestyle and his acquittals, despite the evidence against him, it created this perception that he was above the law, untouchable.
Totally.
But that high profile made him a target, and it really contributed to his downfall in the end.
Yeah. The feds were relentless in going after him. Wiretaps, informants, the whole weight of the RSO statute.
Yeah.
But before we get into that case, let's look at Gotti's inner circle, the guys he trusted, the ones who ended up betraying him.
Yeah. The web of relationships around Gotti is fascinating. He demanded loyalty, but he also inspired a lot of fear. And that's a volatile mix. It's what led to his downfall.
Right. The transcript spends a lot of time on his relationship with his underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano. It's this study in loyalty, ambition, and betrayal.
It's interesting, though. The video doesn't just paint Gravano as like a one-dimensional traitor.
Right.
It hints at a more complex dynamic.
Yeah.
A mix of friendship, respect, but there's this undercurrent of suspicion and rivalry.
Absolutely. The video shows them working together, pulling off heists, sharing the spoils. But you can see the tension growing, the unspoken resentments, that simmering rivalry that explodes later on.
Yeah, and one key thing the video highlights is how different their personalities were. Gotti was the charismatic leader, the showman, the guy who thrives in the spotlight.
Right.
Gravano was the quiet enforcer, more of a pragmatist, the one who got things done.
Behind the scenes. You can see that difference in the transcript. Gotti's making jokes, cracking wise, even complaining about meetings when he'd rather be shopping. Gravano's all business, focused on the details of their criminal enterprise.
Yeah, and that difference in their approach to leadership and power, it created a rift between them. Gotti needed the adulation, the public recognition. Gravano was content to operate in the shadows, amassing wealth and influence quietly.
And as Gotti's profile gets bigger, Gravano starts to resent the heat it brings. He sees Gotti's flamboyance as reckless, a liability.
Right, and that resentment grows because Gotti's becoming more paranoid and distrustful. The video shows Gotti questioning Gravano's loyalty, accusing him of plotting, even threatening him.
There's that one scene, Gotti, in a fit of rage, confronts Gravano about missing drug money, accusing him of skimming profits, undermining his authority. He even brings up a rumor that Gravano wants to take over if Gotti gets hit with a RA co-charge.
Wow, that scene's so important. It shows how fragile their bond had become, how trust and loyalty can just vanish when there's greed, ambition, and paranoia in the mix.
It really does. And it sets the stage for Gravano's betrayal, which has devastating consequences for Gotti and the whole Gambino family.
It's crazy to think about Gravano flipping. He wasn't just some, disgruntled underling. He was a major player in the Gambino family. He knew all their secrets. His testimony was going to be huge.
Yeah, the transcript really shows Gotti getting more and more isolated as the FBI closes in. Surrounded by people but trusting no one, seeing enemies everywhere, that paranoia mixed with all the evidence against him, it makes him push Gravano too far.
It's interesting. Gotti was ruthless, but he still had this code of honor. The idea that a real mafioso never rats.
Right.
But Gravano was practical. He saw what was coming, and he chose to save himself.
The video really shows the impact of Gravano's betrayal, the shockwaves that went through the whole Gambino family, that disbelief that someone so close to Gotti could turn on him.
Yeah, it's bigger than just one guy turning on another. Gravano's testimony shattered the code of silence that protected the mafia for so long.
Yes.
It sent a message that even the most powerful figures were vulnerable, that the walls were closing in.
And for Gotti, it was a huge humiliation. The transcript describes him sitting in the courtroom listening to Gravano detail all his crimes. His face is just this mask of rage and disbelief. The Teflon Don image was gone.
Gravano didn't hold back either. He gave incredibly detailed testimony. He didn't just implicate Gotti. He laid out how the Gambino family operated, the murders, the racketeering, the corruption. He was like pulling back the curtain and showing the world just how brutal the mafia really was.
And for Gotti, having all his dirty laundry aired out like that, it was devastating. He went from being a media darling, the subject of all these articles and profiles, to a convicted felon facing life in prison.
It's a stark reminder that the media's love affair with guys like Gotti can be fleeting. The spotlight that builds them up can also be used to tear them down.
The video ends with Gotti being convicted and sentenced to life without parole. It's a pretty somber ending to a story that started with so much bravado and defiance.
And yet, the myth of John Gotti is still out there. This YouTube video, with its focus on his charisma, his street smarts, his, taking on authority, it all contributes to that myth.
It's interesting, right? Even though the video shows the consequences, the violence, the betrayals, the price he paid, there's still this feeling that he was larger than life, someone who played by his own rules.
That's the paradox of Gotti's legacy. Ruthless criminal, but he had this magnetism, this charisma that still fascinates people.
It does, and I think that fascination speaks to our complicated relationship with figures like him. We're drawn to their power, their defiance, their ability to live outside the system.
Right.
But we also know how dangerous they are, the harm they cause.
It's a reminder that good and evil aren't always so clear-cut, and that even the most notorious people can be both charming and cruel.
So, what did we learn from Gotti's story? This video, with its carefully crafted narrative, doesn't give us any easy answers, but it does offer a glimpse into the allure of power and the destructive consequences of a life built on crime and violence.
It makes us confront our own fascination with guys like Gotti, understand what shaped their lives, and think about the complex legacy they leave behind.
Now, what stood out to you the most about how this video portrayed Gotti? Did it change your perception of him at all?
I think the way they use archival footage and interviews is really striking. It creates this sense of authenticity. Like we're getting a first-hand look at Gotti's world, his rise to power, how he interacted with his crew.
Yeah, and that footage really humanizes him in a way. We see him joking around, showing affection for his family, even moments of vulnerability.
Right, and those moments make his downfall even more tragic. Even the most powerful people aren't immune to fate, betrayal, and the consequences of their actions.
It also makes you think about the media's role in shaping how we see figures like Gotti. When he was on top, he was often portrayed as this charismatic rogue, a kind of Robin Hood figure, operating outside the law but with his own code of ethics.
Yeah, the video plays into that narrative a bit, showing Gotti talking to reporters, throwing those block parties, even refusing to cooperate with the authorities, even when it meant going to prison.
But it also shows the dark side, the violence, the betrayals, the damage he inflicted on everyone around him.
And that's the hard part, right? Reconciling that public image of the Teflon Don with the reality of his actions. the brutality.
It's a reminder that we can't always trust the narratives we're given. We have to look deeper, understand the complexities of these larger-than-life figures.
And the world they inhabit.
That's why these deep dives are so important, analyzing the sources, considering different perspectives, forming our own opinions.
Absolutely.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one aspect of Gotti's story that the video doesn't really explore: his impact on the mafia as a whole.
Oh, that's a good point. Gotti's time as boss was a turning point for them. His style, his willingness to break with tradition, it attracted a lot of attention from the media and law enforcement.
Do you think he ultimately made Cosa Nostra stronger or weaker?
That's a tough one. On one hand, Gotti's charisma, his success in avoiding prosecution for so long, made him a folk hero to some people, and that might have drawn new recruits to the mafia.
You know, there's that romanticized image of the gangster, the outlaw who lives by his own code. It's appealing.
Especially the young people.
Right.
Who feel like they don't fit in.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, Gotti being so high profile made him a huge target. His downfall, how it exposed the mafia's inner workings, led to a major crackdown, which weakened their power and influence.
So it's kind of a mixed bag. Gotti's reign was a time of growth and decline for the mafia. He brought them into the modern era, but he also exposed their weaknesses.
I think that's the most lasting part of Gotti's legacy. He embodied both the allure and the danger of organized crime.
Yeah.
A man who lived by his own rules.
Yeah.
And paid the price.
And his story still fascinates us, not just because of his charisma and his defiance, but because it raises these big questions about power, loyalty, betrayal, the human condition.
It pushes us to look beyond the surface, examine the forces that shape our world, and grapple with the complexities of good and evil.
It's wild how Gotti's story, even with all the bad stuff, still kind of grabs you. Do you think it's because he's like this twisted version of the American dream, the whole rags to riches thing? Even if it's built on, illegal activities.
Yeah, I think there's some of that for sure. Gotti's story plays into that idea of the self-made man, the guy who beats the odds and succeeds on his own terms. But it also shows the dark side of that dream, what you have to give up to get there.
The video definitely doesn't hide that. The violence, the betrayals, how his lifestyle hurts him and everyone around him.
Right. And in those moments where he's vulnerable, where you see the man behind the myth, that's where the story gets really interesting.
Yeah.
It reminds you that even these larger-than-life figures, they're still human, capable of both good and bad.
One thing that stood out to me was how the video showed Gotti's family. They're there for him, celebrating his wins,
Right.
but they also pay the price for his choices.
It's a good point. Organized crime doesn't just affect the people directly involved.
Right.
It impacts families, communities, even society as a whole.
You see Gotti's wife, Victoria, in the transcript, fiercely defending him, totally loyal, even when the evidence is piling up. And his son, John Jr., trying to deal with his father's legacy, the expectations, living in his shadow.
It adds this whole other layer of tragedy to the story. Gotti's choices have these ripple effects, hurting the people he loved the most.
It's rough.
It shows that power, especially when it comes from illegal activities,
Right.
always has a cost.
And that brings us to his legacy. What do you think Gotti's lasting impact will be? Ruthless criminal, charismatic rogue, something in between?
I think it's complicated. He'll always be connected to the violence and corruption of the mafia, murders, extortion, racketeering.
For sure.
But he's also become this cultural icon, a symbol of defiance, ambition, that streetwise charisma.
It's hard to reconcile those two things.
You're right, we acknowledge the harm he caused,
Yeah.
but we're still drawn to him.
We're attracted to the myth, even if we reject what he actually did.
I think it says something about us, how we're fascinated by power. People who break the rules, who seem to defy the odds.
Yeah.
It reminds us that good and evil aren't always black and white. Even the worst people can have qualities we admire, even if those qualities are mixed with darkness.
This video we've been talking about, it plays with that ambiguity. It doesn't give us easy answers or judge Gotti.
Right.
It shows him as a complicated person, capable of good and bad.
And it leaves us to think about the implications of his story.
The questions it raises about power, ambition, and loyalty. The price of living outside the law.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
It makes us look deeper. Think about these complex issues and come to our own conclusions. It's not about saying what Gotti did was okay.
Of course not.
It's about understanding him
Yeah.
and why he still fascinates us.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot today. Gotti's rise and fall, his relationships, his belief in the mafia code, and why people are still so interested in him.
We've also looked at how this YouTube video tells his story,
Yep.
the choices they made, the narrative they created.
The questions it raises about power and loyalty, the human cost of a life of crime. I hope this deep dive has given you a new way of looking at John Gotti and the world he lived in. Keep exploring this topic, dig into the sources, and decide for yourself what you think about the man, the myth, and the legacy of the Teflon Don.